Welcome to The Ambassadors Are In, the state of game audio. So we got some folks here who know a lot about game audio, and hopefully you will learn some things. Maybe you won't, but take that up with these guys. As of 30 minutes ago, I was added as your... Nice.
This is
I was added as your moderator. I am Raheem Jarbo, aka Mega Ran, a video game musician, former teacher, hip-hop artist, and pretty good guy. So here we go. All right, so to my immediate left, we have Mason Lieberman. Mason, here's what his Twitter bio says. He works on Beyblade, Ruby, and he's married. So now.
World's fastest self-intro. Hi, my name is Mason Lieberman. I'm a composer, music supervisor, recording artist, general musician, and game music aficionado. I am basically a music supervisor at Tencent, in charge of a decent amount of the audio department. I work on a lot of games per year, trademark. And in that capacity, I deal with everything ranging from, hiring of composers, both in-house and freelance, managing recording sessions, artists, vendor relations, making sure that we do the right thing, again, trademark, and otherwise deliver a high-quality audio experience. Outside of my work with Tencent, I've been a composer and recording artist for franchises like Ruby, Rising of the Shield Hero, Beyblade, Super Smash Bros., League of Legends, all kinds of random stuff all over the industry. I did a lot of stuff in anime for a while, so there's like 1,000 anime titles.
So a bunch of indie games, basically, for you.
Bunch of small, independent titles with very tiny budgets.
Nice.
Amazing.
Next, Sebastian Wolff, Materia Collective, Louder, and a bunch of things. Give them more.
Hi, I'm Sebastian Wolff. I run a company called Materia Collective. We are a video game music group. We're sort of the first thing of our nature. We're part record label, part community, part music publisher. We empower the longevity of video game music as we look into the next couple of decades of how video game music evolves and how we can empower the labels, the publishers, the artists, the game companies, the composers, musicians, vocalists that we work with, and how we can provide positive impact into our communities. Video game music is sort of my lifeblood. I grew up on it. I play piano. I had a semi-successful YouTube channel back in the 2000s. I'm old. Back before YouTube was a thing, you could upload videos and play piano,
and that was enough.
And that was really enough. It was a good time. I was a creator before there were creators. Wow, that's
very hipster of you.
Wow, that was out of context. Like, don't tweet that. A couple of years ago, I started a company called Louder. We sort of changed how video game music can be seen, commercialized, and how it can impact positively into cover song artists' lives. And after Spotify bought it a couple of years ago, I turned my focus to Materia Collective, and now we have 1,500 different artists and companies that we pay. We have close to 20,000 different assets that we manage. Couple of cover song albums. We have the soundtracks to games like Undertale, Deltarune, Stardew Valley, Celeste, a couple of other ones. And it's really exciting and really empowering to be able to share and empower the artist community with tools and resources. And sort of the insight that I have from a very macro perspective of seeing where the music industry is and where it's going, and how it overlaps with the game industry and where that's going. I need a pop filter on it.
They really do. I mean, it's an SM58. They kind of, like, the head sort of works, but not really.
Does it?
It doesn't work well.
Nah.
I relate to that a lot.
Well, let's get into that. So, last thing you said there was that the video game industry is changing and the music industry is changing. Was there a moment where you felt like, okay, Materia Collective needs to exist now? Was there a moment at something that happened in either industry where you're like, there needs to be this thing because it's not there?
That's a fantastic question. For me, Materia Collective is more of a vessel of how I can provide a resource to the game industry that I have always believed needs to exist. So I grew up, transcribing and trying to perform a bunch of sheet music or perform covers of video game music on piano, and there was never any sheet music out. So, one of the aspects that I'm able to do via Materia Collective, publish official editions of video game music, empower the next generation, make music their own, perform it live on concerts, on YouTube, wherever. And I think that's one of the really cool and exciting aspects of looking at how video game music is viewed and consumed and where it's going as well, and how a vessel like Materia Collective can empower the creators behind it.
Nice.
I think I can actually bounce off from some stuff that I realized we didn't even explain where the title for this panel came from.
Right.
We'll get to that.
Why are we ambassadors?
The ambassadors are
We are,
in.
but we will get to that in a moment because I want to address this first. One of the things that you would often say when we were ambassadoring was that you were trying to provide a resource that didn't exist. Well, coming, in my case, representing AAA audio game development, a lot of times what's going on is that music is basically a rounding error. If someone, random YouTuber, we'll say it's a very successful YouTuber with 500,000 to 1 million subscribers, someone who's not considered a small channel, were to email me as John Q publisher, John Q developer, and say, hey, we would love to properly license one of your soundtracks and do a performance of it. We'd like to do all this stuff legit. Maybe we'd like to make sheet music. Maybe we'd like to do a concert featuring stuff. Maybe we want to license footage. That email almost always wouldn't get answered or just wouldn't get addressed because frankly, the potential income revenue from that is so small a percentage of what we do as game developers, as creators, as publishers, that it's basically background noise, sort of the equivalent of if you were a writer and someone in like 9th grade was like, hey, can I quote your thing? It's like, we don't really care. We're not focused on this right now. That's not what we do as a business. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be what we do as a business. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to focus on these things. We often just don't have the bandwidth to address a lot of these details that the music industry requires. And the music industry very often doesn't know how to communicate with game developers and publishers. They don't really understand they don't understand our industry fundamentally because we don't operate in many of the same ways. We're pretty dissimilar in a lot of ways.
One of my favorite things is to, when I'm engaging with the game industry and explaining, oh, hi, by the way, you're part of the music industry, and their eyes just kind of like bulge a little bit and they slowly back away from the conversation. But it's true, all of us as creators, we are multifaceted in the areas of expertise that we operate in. So, if you are a composer, a cover song artist, someone who engages with video game music on a professional level, you are part of the game industry. You're part of the music industry. You might be part of the, I don't know, the YouTube industry, big video, I don't know.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite things about that is, to make the most of your career and your time that you invest into something, you have to understand a certain aspect of what that industry is and how it works and the requirements of it. And I think it's really fascinating to look at the overlap of these industries and how both of them are running in parallel. In a lot of ways, neither is reflecting. As a very tiny example, video game accessibility is moving to streaming. We have Google Stadia now, and all of a sudden we have the entire streaming thing that has existed and polarized the music industry for the last decade. And it's fascinating because the same discussions are now being had in the game industry. But to back up a little bit, if you want to talk about
let's talk about why we're here. So
I want to first ask, I want to poll the room a little bit. How many of you guys are musicians? Show of hands. All right.
Everyone. Fantastic.
Everybody. All right.
Almost everyone. We've
That's
got two
good.
who aren't.
So how many of you here are interested in working in the games industry? All right.
Almost everyone.
Almost everyone.
Basically the same percentage.
How many of you have a YouTube page? MySpace. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm
How
old.
many of you are old?
Yeah, I got it. That's me. All right. Okay. I'll use that info for my later stuff. Go ahead.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. So a few months back, Sebastian and I were invited, and this will forever remain the coolest thing on my LinkedIn, to be, and I directly quote, international ambassadors of video game music to Australia, which is the best job title I have or will ever have.
That's amazing.
And in that context, basically we were invited by the Australian government to meet with a ton of local businesses, music industry primarily, and government officials. We had dinner with like a member of parliament once, to basically teach them about video game audio, the game industry in general, and help them to better understand where they should be investing, what they should be investing in, how government resources could be more efficiently allocated, how businesses that are completely unfamiliar with game audio can be monetizing their investments in this field, how they could be better using their time working with game audio people, and otherwise how to, make heads or tails of these newfangled megalovania things that seem to be popping up everywhere and that the kids are all into.
All of these megalovanias.
All these megalovanias and these TikToks.
So many things to discuss there. I suppose as a preface, I talked with some other individuals who had also been invited and weren't able to make it. As a disclaimer, as a cis male white dude with privilege working in game audio, this is not the representation of what game audio looks like, of course. And we definitely consider ourselves privileged to be able to have had the experience and the expertise to guide and inform a lot of these industries about the overlap. There have been these amazing experiences with Australia while we were there in Melbourne. Even just from the bottom up, educating the game industry about music. How many of you are composers or affiliated with a performance rights organization? Show of hands. PRO.
ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, those kinds of companies.
How many of you are with an MRO? Yeah, same.
Wait, stop. What's an MRO?
Exactly. So a mechanical rights society. The United States is going to have one next year, January 1st. It is an entire upheaval of what the music industry has had in the US for the last century. No one is aware, prepared, acknowledging of the elephant in the room. And this is one of those fascinations that I've been privileged to see about the game industry. I've worked at the overlap of games and music for close to a decade now, and the lack of prioritization for a very important aspect of games. I don't know, music seems valid and important perhaps, and it's still the rounding error. It's the 11th hour consideration. Oh, we have a game coming out tomorrow. Do we have a soundtrack? Anyone? Do you know anyone? Soundtrack, music? Maybe
Yeah,
we
I
can
mean, a
compose
lot
main
of this
theme.
stuff happens very, very last minute on the development side. I can think of I can't talk about this very much, but there are some major releases I know of coming out within a few months, and music hasn't even started yet, just fundamentally.
Right. And that seems to be common, right? Not
More
just
than
on
it
the
should
AAA
be,
side.
in my opinion. More than it should be. And it's never, in my opinion, it's never a case of a lack of passion on the behalf of the developers. Because I think that, and this is my own personal little grandstand, I think that developers are just the most passionate fans who loved the stuff they do so much that they decided that was going to be their entire lives. That's how they ended up doing that, because otherwise it is not nearly a good enough job to warrant wasting your life on. It is way too much stress and effort when you could just enjoy something casually and let that be enough. So I mean, obviously, game developers care about music, they care about art, they care about making the best thing possible. And it's still always the last thing that happens. It's still the very end of the production cycle when music really comes into the fore.
Has that changed? I mean, I guess in the last few years, has that gotten a little better, or why is that? And how do we, not to say how do we make it a number one priority, but I mean, how do we at some point get music to become a bigger priority when it comes to video games?
I think I can answer that one.
Oh, you can? Good, good.
Go for it.
Okay.
Sure. So part of it is systemic and stems from the origins of the game industry itself. A kind of cool fun fact is that a lot of people who formed the basis of the modern video game development pipeline are a lot of the same people who stemmed originally from the film and TV industry. There's actually a lot of industry overlap aside from, or outside of the programming side. Like a lot of the programmers don't come from film TV side. A lot of the artists, creatives, and specifically business people often did. And in film TV, music is the very last thing that gets done. Part of the fact that music is last is because of how those things are created. If you're going to sync something to a linear media, which is irrelevant for video games, but we'll get to that in a second, say like a TV show or something where every time you watch it, it's the same show, usually you want your music to very tightly sequence to the footage. That way the music reacts, you know, it's not just like static music that's just placed over and has no relation to the footage at all. So you obviously want everything to be as close to done when you write that music so that things aren't changing on you as you're writing it and all of a sudden all the edits are different, the cuts are different. So
it's a good thing that, you know, when films are locked, you know, you simply get to compose the music and they're never unlocked and they never change, right?
I sure wish that was how that actually worked. Sometimes it is, like 1% of the time.
So how is that translated? So we have, you know, from the film world, we have pre-production, production, and post-production, and music kind of happens at the end. To what extent is that still relevant in the game world on the implementation side?
So, for what it's worth, games are better about it. They are not perfect about it, and that's our problem. Games usually do a much better job compared to your film, TV, and all that stuff of bringing music into the conversation earlier, of having people working on their themes, working on basic audio implementation, things like that, prior to, you know, a month before release. Because again, in film and TV, like if you have a movie coming out in October, that music was probably written in like August, September. It's very last minute.
Wow.
Whereas with games, sometimes you might be working on it, if you're really lucky, for years along with the development cycle. As far as whether it could be better, yes, it obviously could be much better. A lot of times, music kind of falls behind because art usually needs to be locked before music is. You want to lock the direction, and it's fairly common in game development to have massive pivots in direction, in design. Because games take such a long period of time to get developed, often several years, oftentimes major developments may occur in the industry that lead you to realize an original idea you had has already come out and will be out for 2 years by the time you release your game, or maybe a certain aesthetic is starting to fall out of favor, or it's getting way overdone and you realize you need to change things. Making a video game is very hard, like back-breaking work that involves hundreds to thousands of people often. So there's a lot of moving parts, and music, by comparison, is often one of the smaller departments in those massive productions. So it can sometimes be forgotten in meetings just a little bit.
Yeah. I was going to say, or I'm used to, I guess, in the music industry, conversations are, if the people want it bad enough, it begins to happen. So therefore, like, the bottom line being the bottom line. Like, if a soundtrack goes platinum, they're like, all right, next time we're getting the soundtrack done sooner. Is that the case when soundtracks are more successful? When there's a wave of soundtracks becoming successful, does that sway the industry a little bit, or no?
I can't think of the last time a video game soundtrack has gone platinum.
Well, no, it's I guess that's
we have aspirations, of course.
Yeah.
Last one may have been Halo, and after that, Undertale, if we're putting numbers on it. But that would imply that, you know, the game companies and its creators, one released the soundtrack on time with proper identifications, and that the creators were part of the right trade organizations like NARAS to establish precedents and be part of the broader music industry. I mean, I'm a fierce advocate for making sure that soundtracks do get a release, preferably before the game even comes out.
Ugh,
you know,
amen.
when you think about the importance of a soundtrack that it has, you know, on the capitalism side, you know, it is best used as a marketing asset to support the game.
Yeah.
You know, having the music available, accessible on fans' platforms of choices is one of the most valuable things that can happen with the music, with the IP, to support the game itself. Because when you think about it, at the end of the day, the music is secondary to the game due to the context. And if the game does not do well, the soundtrack will not do well 99% of the time. Mm-hmm. Or not to consider it in terms of good or bad, but rather the market ceiling, the accessibility, the interest of a potential fandom.
Sales potential.
Exactly. It's all capped. You know, if you have a game and it sells 1,000 units over the course of 2 years, the soundtrack is going to sell less than 1% of that. Mm-hmm. By sheer impact of, or by sheer cause of the fandom being smaller. It's actually interesting because I've noticed over the past 5 years that there's an exception to this rule, and the exception is a vocal track. Mm-hmm. We had the privilege of working with Ryan Ike, who composed the soundtrack to Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Mm. It's a Americana, folk, bluegrass, country jazz-ish album. It's a bit genre-defying, but it is not what you'd traditionally imagine a video game soundtrack to be. There are 9 or 10 vocal tracks on the album. The game was a commercial disaster. It's gorgeous. They had Sting as a voice actor. The narrative, the storytelling is
Great
phenomenal.
Game. You should really check it out, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Really recommend it. But
it's amazing, but it fell short of the potentiality that it had as a successful commercial adventure in terms of reaching the types of audiences that would have really connected with it. However, you look at Ryan Ike's Spotify and you see, you know, the vocal tracks had a life of their own. Each of them have close to 1 million streams, whereas the rest of the soundtrack, all the instrumental tracks, 10, 20,000 streams. So it's fascinating to think about vocal tracks, you know, lyrics that hopefully become more and more prominent in video game soundtracks. You look at Darren Korb's SoundCloud's dead, Spotify. The vocal tracks with Ashley Barrett. Those are the top sellers, the top streamers. You have video game music that is escaping the bubble, the ceiling of what video game music is.
what I can say, that's something that we're keenly aware of, for example, with Tencent. One of our sub-companies that people are usually familiar with, Riot Games, League of Legends.
I've heard of it.
I think a lot of people have probably heard the song KDA that came from that game. That was a marketing asset, essentially. That song charted on Billboard very successfully.
It's still charting, I believe.
It's still charting, like 2 or 3 years later.
Wow.
It has done phenomenally well, and we've had albums of metal that were released with that particular game, the Pentakill Band. And these assets, the videos that they come from, the original YouTube videos or whatever for pushing a particular line of skins or whatever, the skin demand bottoms out depending on the thing, but after like a week or something like that, you know, it has the initial rush, it probably never will have another one again. But these songs continue to perform, continue to vastly outperform anything non-vocal. And we keep that in mind, and so we push more songs. You see more and more songs develop the longer any game exists, because this is usually one of those lessons that most developers uncover as they go, as they realize, oh wait, people listen to this and they really like this. Who knew? Like, aside from everyone in the music industry, I guess. But, you know, again, video game developers, not always as familiar conceptually with a lot of things that might seem like obvious common knowledge in the games industry. And by the same token, game industry folk often not as familiar, or music industry folk often not as familiar with stuff from the games industry.
It's fascinating. You know, you'd think, okay, you know, there's music in video games. I suppose everyone in games is fiercely aware of that, you know, their connection to the music industry. And I still show up at GDC and help people spell out the word PRO. It's quite difficult, and that's sort of the baseline where it begins. Hi, you have 2 copyrights. You have a master and a publishing right. You know, you should register these things. Are you affiliated with these organizations? Are you part of a trade group? Are you part of these things that help you protect your rights to make sure that you have a seat at the table? You know, looking at a much grander aspect, and these are discussions that I've had with very large household name game companies as well as household name music companies, where, you know, what does a collaboration look like between the two industries, how we can support each other. And most of the time, and sort of the direction where the discussion is going, is the game companies are becoming more isolationist because the music industry is utter chaos. It is overburdened by copyright laws and innovations that have been relevant for the last 100 years, before there was a thing like the internet, before you had an interactive sync license, before you had things like arcade machines, which are considered a derivative work, It's an intermittent derivative work that is created due to the fact that you have an input. There was a lawsuit in the 90s that established that certain types of audiovisual recordings of when someone is playing an arcade machine, they're not performances, they're derivative works that are created right then and there, because you have sound effects that influence the musical composition and so forth. This is probably a good time to disclaim that I'm not an attorney and this is not legal advice.
Same here, not an attorney, not legal advice.
Same here.
Rand, however.
No, I am. No, I'm just kidding.
Thank you.
Also, I hope this is okay, but if anybody ever at any point has a question and wants us to stop, I would love for you to raise your hand, come on up, and just
feel free.
Drop it
This is a
in at
conversation.
any time. I would love for this to be a back and forth conversation. I was going to ask, I mean, I had it on here. We kind of touched on it, but I was talking about why do some soundtracks never come out?
Got you. So remember what I said about music being a rounding error?
Negligence.
Like, if we're creating a title that has, we'll say, a potential income floor, I don't know, we'll say like $6 or $7 billion a year.
Those are numbers.
Yeah, because that's, we have like individual games that'll do that.
Okay.
And someone saying, hey, can we reassign 2 people in the company to be exclusively focusing on releasing this soundtrack that, if we're lucky, might generate 1 million streams, because maybe it's not going to be popular, maybe it's not going to work out.
To translate 6 million streams as somewhere between $5,500 and $7,000 on average. It depends.
Like, if a soundtrack release takes a month of time, and we have 2 employees doing it, and let's just generically assume that they're salaried at $70,000 or something. Like, immediately right there, you can already realize the company loses money to spend the time to do a soundtrack release. And that assumes that they own every asset that they need to do it, that they're not having that everything was done work for hire, so they don't have to renegotiate with the composer or something for a license. They don't have to get artists to create assets. They don't have to hire anyone external to the company to release it, and that they then have the knowledge and expertise required to publish and release a soundtrack and collect the royalties therein. And that's an assumption that most game developers fail at. Most don't have music wings of that scale. They might have a music department of like 3 guys, and one of them's the audio director whose job it is to make the sound of the game, and maybe the other person is like his assistant. Like, it's often fairly small departments. A lot of music in games is done, incidentally, on a contract basis. It's done externally using freelancers.
On the AAA side, I think the latest game audio survey had documented that 98% of the AAA games for which music was created was on a work-for-hire basis.
Yeah.
So, and to be specific about a work-for-hire in the traditional sense, you're transferring your copyrights of the master and the composition to the game company, in most cases. And secondarily to that, it is a waiver of future royalties. So any money that might be allocated to the exploitation of the music is waived. It all goes directly to the company. Now, all of this is just utter chaos. It is complex. There's so much metadata, there is so much complexity that is involved with a appropriate music release that is befitting to most games that have music, which is all of them, except maybe 7. And you look at this complexity, and like you were saying, it is never a priority for companies, much less on the indie side. Now, there are DIY platforms, Sounddrop, DistroKid, TuneCore, CD Baby, a few others. Bandcamp tends to be a favorite for simply putting the music up. Don't have to worry about UPCs or ISRCs, ISWCs, ISBNs, ISMNs. It just keeps going. Anyway.
Letters are gone. You're okay.
There's no importance to the vast complexity of the music industry, and you have the option of opting out, right? In a certain sense. Now, the opting out is either a completely negligent decision by simply having no insight into how it should work, or it is simply ignored. Now, for example, Nintendo, not a single soundtrack of theirs is available online. iTunes, Spotify, Deezer, Tidal, Google Play, YouTube Music, none of it is available. And in place you might have stream rips, you have things on SoundCloud or YouTube or other platforms that fans have created. And all of this comes back to sort of my philosophy about music accessibility and a seat at the table. What companies don't realize, looping back to your question as well, why do soundtracks not come out? There are 2 reasons. One, it is never an incentive, and there is no recourse for negligence. Like, sure, you might have fans begging for the soundtrack to come out. I'm still waiting for the soundtrack for Control to come out. I'm still waiting for the soundtrack for Outer Worlds to come out. Outer Worlds? Outer Wilds?
Outer Worlds.
Outer Worlds. That one's not
Wilds
out.
Wilds is the indie.
Yep, that one's out. No,
I think Worlds
Justin,
has a vinyl, yeah.
Not yet. Maybe, who knows? But Justin Bell and his team, they made a fantastic soundtrack. It's gorgeous, it's textures, and ultimately, the strength of a soundtrack is for an accessibility, for inviting fans back into the world outside the context. And the reasons why a soundtrack might not come out, rights, priorities, revenue streams, but ultimately for me, when I'm trying to pitch an opportunity for companies to release their soundtracks by themselves, indie, I don't care, put it out, or if Materia can help, great, let us be your partner for that. For me, it comes down to you are working in the music industry as a game developer, and you want to have a seat at the table. You want a partner and an expert that knows the field, knows the space, can guide and direct you in a certain way. Because most of the time, you will not have the financial fortitude, the priority system in place to make sure that this happens. And 2019 has been filled with incredible soundtracks that could have happened had they been released. Phenomenal game scores that are out. You look at the Game Awards, only 2 out of the 5 nominees for Best Music or Best Soundtrack only 2 out of 5 are available on Spotify.
Wow.
And then you consider that to be extrapolated to the tens of thousands of games that have come out that have never had a soundtrack release.
And that, to me, as a musician, doesn't seem like it would take that long to put these songs on Spotify.
It can be absurd because even the biggest games in the world will have this problem. You mentioned Nintendo. League of Legends just dropped its soundtrack on the 10-year anniversary of the release. That was when they're like, finally, we're going to release the soundtrack.
Wow.
We'll have a vinyl release. It's going to be great. We've only been making billions of dollars for 10 years to finally determine that we have enough money to justify the time to maybe release the soundtrack.
And that's the thing. Sorry, you were...
So, weird question. Does this put composers at a point where, not that they don't have a seat at the table, but where maybe their legacy is a little bit at stake? I mean, do you feel like it's not...
It's tarnished.
Yeah.
It's disappointing, yeah. Categorically, one of the things I'm fighting at for Tencent, one of the things I want us to be an industry leader in, and which Tencent is working very hard at, is we want to do more to feature our composers, to show off how talented the musicians we work with are. We work with the best composers in the industry, bar none, and why aren't we trying to do live concerts with their music? Why aren't we releasing soundtracks? Why aren't we using the full value of this marketing
because they haven't gone platinum. This is, I guess, what we're saying is that.
But in some cases, they haven't gone platinum because we never gave them the chance to.
Didn't give them the chance.
And that's because a lot of people just don't have the frame of reference for it to understand the potential value.
It takes a lot of work. So, Materia Collective, we're a tiny company. We're 5-6 full-time. We're a small team. But for us to release a soundtrack, say 20 tracks, a single composer, is probably a week's worth of commitment for 3 people, which means that all of a sudden we have, salary that is dedicated to a soundtrack release, and most of the time that will never recoup in terms of money spent on employees. The risk, the liabilities that come with that, the potential revenue sources, it is imbalanced, which, I'm very happy to be a sounding board of hey, do I need a label? Do I need a music publisher? Most of the time the answer is no. There's a lot of opportunities for DIY. So to put things in perspective, Undertale and Deltarune combined, for those not in the know, little indie game made by a kid in his parents' basement, 2015. It is one of the most impactful games of the last 2 decades in terms of how it has shaped and evolved the fan communities, how it has shaped and evolved the expectation of what an indie game can be and what it can do and what it can affect. The Undertale and Deltarune soundtrack get between 450 and 500,000 streams a day on Spotify and Apple Music alone. And it's not so much the royalty side, sure, the money is great, I'm sure Toby is having a blast, but it is the impact that it causes. When you think about the communities that have formed around the fandom of Celebration, they have had the accessibility to celebrate and enjoy and listen to their music that they enjoy and connect with most on their platform. And in lieu of a soundtrack release that happens on a timely manner, that potential for being a fan on your terms is lost. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really tragic. So, even now when you have new platforms like TikTok, we had the opportunity to work with them and get our soundtracks up on TikTok and delivered. And a couple of months in, I'm looking at the streaming counts, and it's in the hundreds of thousands for some of the soundtracks that we have. Because we have fan artists who are, making 30-second little illustrations of their favorite characters or their favorite scenes from the game. And, oh, cool, the soundtrack's up. I'll just add that as the background music. So we have an entire community that is celebrating their favorite game, their favorite IP, their favorite characters from something that is personally significant. And music is the backbone that binds it all together. And not prioritizing the accessibility and the availability of the music, proliferation across the platforms, I think the politest way I can put it is disrespectful to the rest of the team that has invested so much into making something beautiful that connects with an audience.
So what can a composer do if most of our folks here are composers?
Yeah.
that was kind of like stunning, the 98% being work for hires,
Right.
which is where you take your money and you leave and you can't ever do anything with it again. So where does that leave a composer? Like how do they take back their legacy? Is there a way, a suggestion?
Well, a lot of times when you do a work for hire, just for a quick frame of reference clarity, that doesn't inherently mean that you're not receiving credit, that you're not going to be credited on the album, on the thing. Mm-hmm. It depends on the company, because there are some companies, I'm not going to say names, that I know that actually do not credit all the artists who work on stuff, or maybe they'll credit the lead composer, but then they don't credit all the assistant composers who wrote 80% of the music on the stuff.
Right.
Right, and we don't need to talk about Konami, but
I said nothing.
every contract comes with, it's a bundle of rights, right? You know, it's not just like, here's the music, I'm selling it to the company. It is, here's how much I get compensated. Here's what it will do, how it will be interpreted. Here's the terms and conditions. You know, these contracts can stretch, you know, dozens of pages for larger companies and be, you know, depending on the size of the company, be increasingly in their favor. You know, looking at, you know, the terms of a Microsoft contract that they are presenting. You know, as we're talking about buyouts and Netflix and Discovery Networks in terms of equitable compensation models for its creators, I would not weigh some of these terms as positive on a longevity aspect. However, looping back to the question, what can us as creators, as composers do? You know, work with an attorney. There's plenty of them floating around at MAGFest. If you don't have anyone, come talk to me. I will introduce you and we
Work
can do
with
a
Brandon.
chat.
He's right here. He's an
Yep.
attorney.
He is
I'm
not
not
an attorney.
an attorney.
But to finish up real quick, goodbye. Finish up really quick about what can we do? Put something in the contract, even if it's just a single line that you write yourself. Say, you know, within 6 weeks of the game's release, you know, studio game developer guarantees that a, you know, official soundtrack is released, you know, and you know, and this is what happens if the soundtrack is not released. You know, put a reversion clause in there. Make sure that you get the rights back. Which, one last note about that, we're approaching an interesting era. In the US, there is a Copyright Reversion Act, which is the biggest protection that musicians and composers have. And the video game industry is new, it's fresh, it's still a baby. It's 35 years old at maximum. It is completely young, and no one in the game industry has any idea about these reversion rights. So if hypothetically you are a composer who composed something in the 90s, there are ways you can simply say, hi, I'm taking back my copyrights, and these will be my exclusive way to exploit them. I will publish the soundtrack myself. I need reciprocal royalties backdated for the usages of this game now. 2020 is the year where the music industry and the game industry collide in a couple of really spectacular ways, and no one's prepared. But
So excited.
that's a tangent which I can talk about at length.
I would love to talk to you about that off mic
length.
at another time.
Oh, yeah.
Life. We got a question. Come on up. Hurry. Come on
What's
down
up?
to the mic. Come on down.
Oh, and one thing that I will quickly say, just to kind of piggyback off with regard to compensation standards in game industry, as opposed to, say, film, TV, because I know you mentioned Discovery, and there might be a composer in here or two who are like, oh, I heard Discovery's going to stop doing royalties and whatever, things like that. But the game industry doesn't do royalties. Doesn't that mean it's the same thing? Game industry has developed in a way where the packages that we're offering people, the money that we pay up front for these rights, is livable if you don't have these back-end royalty systems. And frankly, a lot of the reason why there's no back-end royalties, because a lot of things involved in the game industry do not generate royalties. There's a famous case until this year.
Hey.
But there was a case back in 96? No, it was 2006, I think. The one that defined the definition of a download in relation to being considered like a purchase or stream. I know it's going to drive me nuts that I'm blanking on it. but basically the conclusion that a download was not a performance. And suddenly one of the side effects, because this was meant as like a thing for people like pirating or streaming, like that type of thing. One of the side effects of this lawsuit was, wait, so that means that if a game sells, like if a video game sells in the PlayStation Store, someone downloads it, that somehow doesn't count as a performance, even though technically, if we were talking about movies and you sold like a movie at a theater and they bought a ticket to it, or they purchased a DVD, those would generate royalties. It's kind of weird side thing that has to do with why video games don't generate royalties in the same way that film and TV do.
Hold on one sec. Let's take our question.
So our question.
What's your name?
Jeff?
Hey, Jeff. What's your question?
Hey, Jeff.
So my question is more about indie games than like AAA kind of thing, but maybe this is just my experience, but a lot of indie developers I've worked with, they just want to do a work for hire because they're like, when I bring up all their sorts of like ideas, they're like, I don't want to deal with that, I don't want to deal with figuring out all this stuff, I just want to own it and be done with it. Do you think there's anything that composers can do to kind of like more normalize that with indie developers who don't have like a legal team and aren't used to maybe negotiating this kind of stuff?
Yes, and that's a fantastic question, and I'm really passionate about this. In 2018, 2018, the Game Audio Survey, I think it's 53 or 57% of, like, if we're talking about the three categories of games, you know, we have our indie casual, we have our mid-core, and we have our AAA. Broad buckets, just a matter of logarithmic millions that are invested in the game. For like indie and mid-core, I think it was 53% of music was work for hire, which is phenomenal compared to like 98% in the AAA era.
Yeah.
So us as composers, as creators, we have to be the ones to educate the game companies, the game developers, the game publishers that we work with, that they don't want to be burdened by owning music. They want to have a license. And most of the time that is in the form of, you know, they get to use the music for free in marketing assets, and they get to have a sync license that allows them to put the music in the game. And most of the time that is all they want and all they need. You know, coming back to the idea that, you know, you're not just selling or licensing a game company your rights, it's a complete bundle. You know, how do they get to use it? When do they get to use it? How do they remit royalties? You know, it's just like a gigantic laundry list of what you're allowing them to do with the thing that you create. And, you know, a small tangent, but one of the things that I sort of ask the artists that we work with at Materia Collective, you know, for a project that you want to put out through us, you know, do you have immediate needs? Like, do you need cash up front to make this thing? Do you have short-term needs? You know, like, you know, cash and maybe a couple of royalties? Or is this just a long-term project? You know, do you want this to exist and just generate money? And I think bringing some of that knowledge to the discussion table for games, like, okay, well, if this is an indie game and it's not a Undertale or a Celeste, you know, what does the shelf life look like? You know, is it going to develop traction? Is it going to have a fan base that 30 years from now is still going to make covers of it? And I think accounting for the longevity of the music in games is one of the most valuable things. So I'm a firm believer in holding on and retaining your rights as much as possible.
Yeah.
And if someone wants a buyout, you give them a buyout rate and explain, like, look, this is what you get. And for the, I don't know, what's the AAA buyout rate? 5K per minute? Something. It's a very broad range. I say 5K because that sounds pretty great.
Sometimes.
But for, again, charge for the client, charge for the project, right? But it's not just the music in the game. It is the soundtrack, the exploitation, the let's plays, the legacy, the chronology of your contribution to the game industry, to those creators. So it is much more vast than just music in the game. And I mean, it's a very complex thing to, like, you know, pin that down into 2 sentences at the negotiation table, but
I think I can give it a shot, though.
do it.
What I would say, in this theoretical situation where I'm an indie composer, because I've never been an indie composer, he said lying, there's a lot that goes into music publishing, and it's a lot cheaper for you if you just let it be my problem. What I would basically say is something to the effect of, if your goal for music is you want to create the most valuable asset, get the most bang for your buck, the most marketing, the best product, all this stuff, frankly, you're saving yourself money by paying less to just secure a license instead of a full work for hire, just doing this easier type of rights transfer and just going ahead and letting it be my problem. Like,
I love that concept so much. No one is going to care more about the music that you create than you and your superfans. Most of the time, the game company is not going to be as passionate about making sure that your music is heard in as many places as possible and is enjoyed by the fan base beyond the construct and the context of the game than you are. So if you are giving up rights, make sure that you have protections in place that whoever gets to hold on to your baby
has to take good care of it.
Is taking good care of it. That's a good way of putting it.
And the one thing I'll say, just to kind of develop that as the AAA equivalent for that phrase, there's a reason in AAA why we want all of these rights and why we want to hold these things and have it all be taken care of. That reason usually isn't relevant on the indie side, because usually the shelf life of these things is much shorter if you're not expecting it to be a 20-year franchise. If you're working on the next Mario game, you know that it's going to be around for a long time, and it's a different type of calculation metric in your head.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, there are some very famous examples that I won't name directly because some of them aren't publicly well known, where this was handled improperly by game companies, where they didn't secure these rights on what have gone on to be very long-living franchises with well-known music, where the fans would never forgive them if they stopped using these themes, but where they have to pay the composers hefty payouts every time they do it because they don't own the music and they need to relicense it every single time. Some of these are ones that would make your head spin if you realized that those companies don't actually own that music, kind of thing.
I mean, in the 80s and 90s, the contracts were hastily written messages over IRC.
Yeah.
Or other forms, or simply just emails sent and forgotten on listservs that are long gone. Like, there's no proof of those licenses.
And sometimes they were written in the mid-2000s by some of the largest tech companies in the world who should have known better, and they just had really lazy people who didn't file their paperwork on time.
Do your diligence.
That's interesting.
That's great.
As I'm thinking, I'm like, there's no game. Thank you for the
Great question. Thank you.
There's no game that was, a new sequel to an old thing that I loved that couldn't be successful without the theme music of that game.
Oh, there are tons.
And then I start really thinking, and I'm like, well, maybe there are a few.
What happens if you play a Sonic game? Like, who out here is going to notice if they released a Sonic game without any version of Green Hill Zone? Like, who's going to notice Mario games with no version of the Mario theme? Like, if there was just like a 5-year gap where the Mario theme never showed up in any Mario game, you would notice.
I gotta think about it. I feel like that, I don't know if that would bother me, but I would probably notice.
Maybe it'll bother you, maybe it won't. But you'll notice it,
Yeah.
and there are people who that will bother.
Yeah.
And
I mean, you can still
notes.
have
Good
chicken
point.
soup without chicken, but if you enjoy broth, that's fine. Other questions?
That's good. We're down to probably our last 10 minutes, so we can take questions from the audience. If anybody has any specific or general questions about game audio or otherwise.
Music
or
business.
anime.
Music business, anime, whatever.
Jazz.
If not, I'll come up with something.
We can talk about Mega Ran's career or his
Or my sweet new
legacy
shirt.
designing shirt. Look at how great this shirt
I
is.
need a shirt.
It's
I showed up
only
too late.
$20.
I'll bring you a
guys.
shirt.
You
I
deserve
will buy a
this.
shirt.
Thanks. Yes, video game music. The next one I do. Video game music is art. It's life for a lot of us, and us here we're just passionate folks who really care about the music, and hopefully you guys are. I mean, you wouldn't be at MAGFest if you didn't. So that's what I love most about being here, is that be seeing the full passion in folks who just love video game music and want it to continue and want to thrive. And most importantly, I want these composers to thrive and to live extremely well, like they deserve to be, you know.
And we want you to rap at us. It's very important to us as composers.
Thanks. I'll be rapping at you tomorrow night. Just a quick shameless plug on the MAGFest stage, 9 p.m. Myself and K Murdoch will be playing a 10th anniversary of a record we put out. Personal question, but it'll be kind of hopefully interesting. We made an album 10 years ago called Forever Famicom.
10 years ago.
10 years ago.
Wow.
You remember
roughly
this?
one League of Legends ago.
Yep. On this album, we sampled a lot of NES, SNES stuff.
Did you clear those samples?
Nah. You know, it's hip hop.
I wouldn't. Maybe this panel shouldn't be filmed anymore.
It's fine. It's fine. So it's been 10
Statute of
years.
limitations is 6 years.
Yeah, we're good. It's been 10 years. So here's what's up. This sounds like legal advice. Hold on.
No, it's not legal advice. Don't worry.
Okay.
So hypotheticals.
All right. So it's hypotheticals. So hypothetically, with it coming up on 10 years, it'll be 10 years in June. A lot of my friends are like, okay, so I know you're going to re-release this thing, right? And I'm like, now knowing what I know about the industry, I am not planning on this re-release at all. But I've had friends say, well, why not just replay a lot of the samples, get composers in, try to get licensing through a company like Materia Collective, talk about these mechanicals and things and sort that out. So is that something that's even hypothetically possible?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, straight up. Like, and it's a lot easier, in my opinion.
Now these are,
And
again,
maybe
80s and
you
90s
disagree.
titles from, some huge ones. Well, maybe not. Well, yeah, there's some huge ones. And then some like tiny ones from maybe the NES or whatever. Is it still
It's easier if you're not also having to license the sound recording. One of the things that can sometimes make this an impossible process is that there are legitimately situations where the person who owns the master and the person who owns the composition aren't actually the same person, and so somehow you have to negotiate the same thing twice with totally different people who want totally different things.
Wow.
And that can be one of your issues, one of your roadblocks in getting something done. So
It can get super exciting. So I come from the world of music rights, licensing, and clearance, and it gets super exciting, especially when you have 5 people who all say they own 25% of something. It gets
That's
really
fun.
exciting when you have rounding errors. Japan doesn't work on percentages of ownership, they work on twelfths. So what happens if you have 7 people who have an equal share in a song? It gets really fun when that translates to US percentages and you have 96.23% or something of full ownership, which has to be extrapolated to 100. If you have rounding errors, if you have 6 co-writers and 6 co-publishers involved with something, and everyone owns 16.66%, and all of a sudden you're off by 0.3% at the very end, which is fine for most usages, but if you have 10 million streams of something, all of a sudden you're off by a couple $100. I kind of want to have the closing note of some of this stuff. Knowing some of the basics about how the music industry works is invaluable to any career. If you want to make it, know a bit about publishing, know a bit about performance royalties, publishing royalties, mechanicals. There is a $8 billion with a B dollar annual deficit in unmatched royalties in the US alone. So when you think about all these tiny rounding errors, all of these companies that, music that is used across digital and physical platforms that is licensed, where you don't have a owner that comes forward and says, hi, this is my composition, or this is my sound recording, I own this, please pay me.
yeah.
All of those tiny little pieces of negligence have added up over the years, and the market ceiling for some of that stuff is, well, $8 billion. So get your share.
Collect your stuff. Make sure that you're properly registered. Make sure you're following up on this. This is where you potentially want to have a partner.
The biggest
I think
thing,
we have a question. Go ahead.
Wait, no, this is important. The biggest thing, those royalties expire, and if you don't get them after 2 years, Katy Perry gets your money.
Dang.
Good stuff.
Good stuff.
Hi, Diwa.
Hello, friends.
Hey, what's your name?
Yeah, so those who don't know, I'm Diwa. I'm a composer and YouTuber as well.
Yay.
My question is actually related to back to indie games as well. I was actually in that exact same situation where I'm working with an indie developer, and at first he was okay with me retaining the rights to music, but then he suddenly started to partner with a different publisher, and the publisher wanted to own the rights of the music. Thankfully, luckily for me, the developer was easy to talk to, so I was able to convince him, yes, I get to keep the rights, and what you basically said earlier, you don't need to do the hassle of managing the rights of the music and all of that. But my question is related to, what if in a situation where I'm not as lucky with a kinder developer, and
What if you get Netflixed? Is basically what you're trying to say. So
no.
to make the joke-
Is there some sort of metric for you, for example, from you specifically Mason, because of your experience in composing, is there some sort of metric for you to judge if a totally unknown game, a totally new game in development will have a long shelf life or some sort of very tiny shelf life? Is there some sort of unwritten metric?
Good question. Thank you.
Unfortunately, yes, and it's unwritten. So the reality on that is that anytime you're working with an unproven team, an untested IP, a brand new concept, something that you have no idea whether or not it's going to work or not, and you have nothing to indicate whether or not it should, there's no one, well-known or with a track record that you can point to say, well, it'll probably be kind of like this last thing they did. You really do just kind of have to do your own gut check and determine what you think it's worth. This is where market research can come into play. You could say, oh, I'm going to do a shoot-'em-up game that's going to come out on the Nintendo Switch, and we're going to do artist collaborations with 3 composers who are pretty cool in this particular thing, but maybe they're not huge names that random people would know.
Yeah,
What might that sell like? And then I would probably look up similar games, see how they did, and then, part of it is, hey, does it seem like these guys are as on the ball as this company was when they did this? Does it seem like they might be doing better at this point than they were at that point?
Yeah,
And you guess it.
Do your due diligence.
The reason I ask is because in regards to giving up rights, what if you kind of sense that this game is going to have a short shelf life, so even if I gave up the rights, it doesn't really matter in the long run, because
Then that means you're probably happier taking the buyout.
I'm not.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, that's just a case where analyze what the money they're offering you is for them to take you out of this equation, so to speak, and analyze what you think the money is going to be if you stay in that equation. The fact of the matter is, there's no guarantee that you're going to be right. I don't think that Toby Fox could have predicted that Undertale was going to do what it did. When he had the Kickstarter, they made $50,000. When the game came out, millions of people bought it.
At least 56,000.
At 56,000, at least 56,000 people purchased it.
If you are giving up an advance or a buyout rate in exchange for royalties, you become a shareholder, you become an investor for that team. So make sure that the people you work with on a revenue share basis, that I'm not suggesting that you trust them, but that you trust in their capacity to ship the game, to uphold it, to make sure it's successful, and that you have vetted the people that you're working with, so that, if something comes to light 5 years from now and the game has to be canceled due to who knows what, that you still have your music and your potential revenue source isolated from that. Is probably the best response I have
That's
for
good
that.
advice. Thank you.
That's a great
All right,
question.
if there are no other questions, or if you want to stop one of these guys and harass them throughout their MAGFest travels, I
Thank you guys so much.
highly recommend
It
it.
was fun.
They're very knowledgeable. If you could, make some noise for our panelists. All right, guys, shout out your Twitter handles so they can hit you up with any random questions. Start with you, Mason.
At Mason Lieberman.
All right, Sebastian.
At Sebastian Wolff with
That's
2
so
L's.
difficult.
Shockingly easy.
It's so difficult.
Amazing.
I'm at Megaran. It looks like Meg Ryan, but it's not. And I guess that's about it.
Thank you.
What's happening
Thank you
next?
so much,
No
dude.
problem.
Thank you
30
for
minutes
moderating.
notice. I've moderated this with, but I hope you guys enjoyed it and got something cool out of it. I learned a lot. I'm going to be going to see Samus at 10 p.m. I highly recommend that performance on main stage. And I guess that's it. See y'all later.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Thanks for coming, guys. If you have any questions, feel free to
Yeah, come pull
harangue
them
us.
aside for a question.